Americans for Safe Access is celebrating our 23rd anniversary. For over 2 decades, we've brought medical cannabis stakeholders together to meet the immediate needs of patients while addressing knowledge, policy, and regulatory gaps, clearing the way for a national medical cannabis framework that serves all patients. What you may not know is that ASA has been women-led ever since I founded the organization in 2002. For our 23rd anniversary, I've created this series where I've interviewed women who have taught me everything I know about medical cannabis. My goal is to share the inspiration that these women have brought to my life with new and seasoned advocates alike. I'm honored to present the women who crush, the women who get shit done. My next guest, Amanda Reiman, is a researcher, an author, and a good friend. She has always been a great ally to Americans for Safe Access and honestly has been a part of with every one of our major initiatives. Amanda has played a key role in bridging advocacy with academia, and I just can't wait for you to meet her. Hello, Amanda.
Hi, Steph. Great to
I'm
see
so
you.
excited. So good to see you. Thank you for taking some time today to talk to me
My
and to
pleasure.
my soon-to-be, I'm sure, millions of viewers. I'm creating this project in an effort to, kind of one show, um, folks, this the rich tapestry of people that are doing this work. And it's not necessarily about being women. It just turns out that most people that I know that are actually doing shit are women. So, so it worked out well. I can't believe we've been working together for 2 decades.
I know. I
It
know.
looks so great. It must be the cannabis, right?
It must be the cannabis.
Well, I always start off just, tell me a little bit about how you got involved with cannabis, like what that looked like for you.
Sure. So, I grew up in the 1980s and 90s in the middle of the country, in Indiana, and definitely subject to all of the dare messaging and the just say no messaging. And, sounding like the Gen Xer that I am, no internet. So, no ability to look up and see if what I was being told was true, just kind of having to take it as truth. After I graduated high school, I moved down to Austin, Texas, and that's where I got my real education in drugs. It was the mid 90s, it was the rave era. There were a lot of drugs floating around, and some of the things that I saw confirmed what I had been taught about some of the risks of using substances, and a lot of what I saw challenged what I had been taught about using substances. And so I did a paper as an undergrad for an honors thesis on DARE. And that was the first time I uncovered that the government had been lying to us about drugs. Oh my gosh. And, using data from the Lynn Smith Center, which became Drug Policy Alliance, and Drug War Facts, and some of these
Mhm.
really early sources of information, really started to question what I had been taught and started to understand more about the real goals of drug prohibition, which of course were controlling certain groups of people and really had nothing to do with saving us from the dangerousness of drugs. So I started diving deeper into that and became an advocate. I got involved in 1998 when Students for Sensible Drug Policy formed in response to the Higher Education Act, which prevented people with drug felonies from getting federal funding for college. Attended their first national conference and was like blown away. I mean, the thing I was blown away about the most was that I was always taught that anybody that supported drugs in any way, shape, or form was a loser, and was not going to amount to anything and was a stupid person. And what I came away with from that first conference was that there were a lot of brilliant, brilliant people that felt that drug prohibition was wrong and were actively working to change it. So that's what I really got interested in, was the systemic racism and the social justice components of the drug war. I got a master's degree in social work in Chicago, and then I decided to get a PhD because honestly, I felt that as a woman, no one was going to listen to me when I said that I knew what we needed to do, unless I went all the way and became like an expert. I was like, there's
Right,
pass me off as some bleeding heart liberal social worker unless
right.
I have the cred. So I moved to the Bay Area in 2002, which is when I met you. Lots going on in the Bay Area at that time around medical cannabis. Had no idea in Chicago that medical cannabis was even a thing. Again, very little internet. And I was really taken by the community-based framework that early dispensaries were operating under. From a social work perspective, we studied so much information about how health services, we were struggling to get health services to people, and they were very expensive and people couldn't afford them. And here you had these dispensaries that were not only offering cannabis, many times for free, but were offering massage services and chiropractic services and access to legal support and internet and free food and bingo night and pet sitting and all of these things for free to patients. And it was such an amazing community-based health model, of course, built off of the community health model that emerged in the 1980s and 90s around HIV and AIDS and the LGBTQ plus community in San Francisco. I decided to study that for my dissertation. And one of the reasons I studied it was because it was there. Another reason was because I knew that that model was not going to be around forever. And that as we saw cannabis become more normalized and regulated, we were going to go from what I call the social club model to the pharmacy model of like Walgreens. Um, and because I felt that there was such a lack of data that actually looked at the potential benefits of cannabis. And everything I had read was coming from this negative perspective that cannabis was bad, it was addictive, people who used it, had problems. And there was nothing to counterbalance that. There were advocates who were saying, no, this is really helping me. But there was no data. And so it wasn't being taken seriously. And I remember in 2003, I did a summer internship for MPP. And part of my job was to go to like that time, very conservative areas of California, like Stockton and Manteca, and hand out flyers at the 4th of July parade that had the person in the wheelchair with the cannabis leaf and them getting beaten over the head, and it would say, do you think that AIDS and cancer patients should go to jail? And while a lot of people supported it and were like, no, I think cannabis, these should have access, an equal number of people said, well, if they're using weed, they should go to jail.
Right.
And so just remembering that like this was the perspective, and I was like, well, how do we change this? And I thought, well, we're going to change it by bringing legitimacy to the research. And that's what really got me involved. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time as a medical cannabis patient myself, having access to these dispensaries. And I always say that, my first study, the fact that I walked up to those dispensary doors when they were not legal
Yeah.
and had both a medical cannabis patient card and a letter from UC Berkeley saying that that study was approved by the university, that's what got me in. That's
Yeah.
what got me the permission to sit in a dispensary and hand out surveys to people that came in. And if I only had one or the other, I don't think they would have given me access.
Right.
So that's really where it all started.
Yeah, no, and just to kind of underline what you just said, as an advocate during that time, we were dealing with federal raids on one hand, educating the people who were working in that space, making sure they knew that they were committing federal civil disobediences, making sure they were ready to be arrested, all of that crazy work. But then trying to explain to the public what was happening, right? Because really these were just drug dens, right? This was on paper, and I guess in the eyes of the federal government they still are. But it was really having your published work that made such a huge difference, because I remember, you remember those condition-based booklets that I created that were like medical cannabis and cancer. So, and I think they said marijuana, medical marijuana and cancer. And I could not get any scientist or doctor to put their name on them, even though I got them to help me write them. So I was like, okay, you want Steph the activist to hand out pamphlets on cannabis and cancer, right? So it made such a huge difference.
Well, it's hard. I mean, scientists rely on soft money, right? So they
Yeah.
rely on getting grants from the federal government to do their research. And when that grant dries up or is over, they have to get another one. It's like a trapeze act, right? So they have to have another trapeze coming in because they have to let go of the one that they're on and they have to
Right.
grab onto something. And so a lot of science, this is like a larger issue with just like the scientific research community at large,
Right.
but they have to study what the government wants to fund.
Right.
And I remember in the 90s under Bush Sr., looking at what was being funded by the federal government in terms of drug research. And it was only research about the negative consequences of drug use and preventing teens from using drugs. Those were the only things they cared about. So I could not go to them with a proposal to do research that looked at the benefits of cannabis or even what we would call just regular adult cannabis use in the general population because they didn't want to know about it. Now, I was able to do my research, my early research, as a postdoc or a pre-doc, and then as a postdoc. So, like, I had funding from the federal government to do research.
Right.
I chose to do research on this. And a funny story, I don't know if you remember this, but you did a press conference in San Diego, and this must have been like 2006, maybe 2007. And I stood up there and gave the results of my study. I was like, we found that dispensaries are beneficial to communities, they're community health service providers. People are getting something out of them. They're providing community health benefits. And then there was an article the next day in the San Diego paper that said the headline was like, dispensaries good for communities, federal researcher says.
Yeah.
And the federal government called my boss at my research job and said, she can't say this. Like she's under a federal grant. She
Right.
cannot be saying anything beneficial about cannabis. And my research mentor, love her, amazing woman,
Right.
said, look, she's a scientist. She's going to report the results as they are. And whatever they are, that's what she's going to say. But she did tell me that I was going to have to make a decision, that I was either going to have to go into the regular research pipeline and just study what they wanted to fund and hope that it came around to a day when that included the benefits of cannabis, or I was going to have to go off on my own. And that's when I decided to go off on my own and convinced Berkeley Patients Group to give me a job as director of research and patient services and did my first study on cannabis substitution, which was in 2008, until
Such
they
an
got shut
important
down
state.
by
Yeah.
Melinda Haig. So it was tough for researchers, and it still is, even though we have, like, Berkeley has a cannabis research center now, like we have opportunities, there's still very, very few. And so it's hard for researchers to feel like they're jeopardizing future funding by attaching themselves to something that their funders may view as controversial. And that's something that still makes it difficult for researchers to go down that road.
Yeah, no, and it's it's for on the medical drug development side. I don't know if people know how much of a impact that NIH has on and how much the government, how much US taxpayers pay for drug development. I saw a study recently that out of like the last 356 drugs that had come out of FDA, I guess no, 358 of 356 of those, NIH had spent about $1.4 billion each on preclinical, right? And so if you take that number and look at what NIH has given towards cannabis research, it's actually about the same, but 1.2 billion of that is to prove the harms, right? So
Exactly.
it's like there's no, I think that's an interesting perspective. I don't think a lot of people think about is people aren't researching unless there's money.
Right, right. I mean, unless you're independently wealthy and you're like, I don't need to work, so I can just do research on whatever I want, or you're a private entity and your whole goal of research is to show that whatever you're selling
Right.
works. So yes, it's very hard to get independent funded research on something that the government has taken a stance on. And unfortunately, it really limits our knowledge. In 2008, I submitted a federal grant to do a national cannabis survey because our data on cannabis still is so poor and is relegated to like the National Survey on Drug Use, which is like, have you smoked a joint in the last 6 months? Like it was just terrible. So I made the case that like, hey, the laws are going to start changing, even though we had no adult use yet.
Yeah.
And the government should start tracking and collecting data on using behavior in the general public. Like we need to see how things change as laws change. We need to understand where the vulnerability points are. And I mean, I put together a research team of like pretty conservative
Yep.
researchers. And when I got the grant application back, it was not funded. And when I looked at the comments, most of the negative comments were around my advocacy work, that they didn't think I could lead a non-biased study on cannabis because I had spoken out against prohibition. And
Right.
to me, that was so crazy because it was like if I was studying child abuse and I was at an anti-child abuse rally, no one would say that my research on child abuse was biased. But because I didn't think people should go to jail for using cannabis, that somehow that detracted from my ability to be a good researcher, even though I had a PhD and I went through training. So
Right.
these are still the things that researchers face when people are out there going, why isn't there more data? Like, this is why.
Yep. No, and it's such a such an important gap, right? Because you have people. It's also frustrating because you have people like Bertha Madras, right, who gets funded for everything horrible she wants to say about cannabis, and she is absolutely biased, right? Like and she's everywhere. Like I was in Vienna testifying, and there she was. Like, what are you doing here? And her, her studies are laughable because they are so biased, right? Like I think that's the challenge. But I also know that again, that bias goes over into the medical research, or I'm sure you've heard stories from like Dr. Abrams, who had to turn, basically design his study to prove that cannabis would harm patients to get the funding to study, the effect on immune systems. And Igor Grant, right, from San Diego, same thing. He had to like design his studies to prove that cannabis would was harmful for your lungs to get funding on the other side of that.
Yeah,
Um,
it's sad that we have to play these games, but here we are.
yeah, and I don't know how, there a big difference I've seen is that, when we started, there was just the uh, Cannabis Research Center in San Diego that had been created by the legislature in California, but it was not well funded. So they were still depending on NIDA funds for research. And now there's about 40 research centers in the United States, getting some money from the states that have the tax, from cannabis sales, some from private entities. But have you seen a big difference? I mean, do you think we're gonna catch up in that space, or is it really gonna take a a change in attitudes at the federal level to open those funds?
Well, we're getting there. I mean, because we started at like nothing. So, I mean, Paul Armentano from Normal was always fond of comparing, like when you search PubMed for
Yeah,
articles about cannabis, how we were down around like 100 per year, and now we're at like thousands per year.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
yes, we are definitely seeing an improvement. However, they're still mostly focused on preventing harm. So it's things like pregnant women using cannabis and DUI with cannabis and teenagers who use cannabis and the developing brain. So, like, we definitely still see more studies focused on the potential harms from cannabis and preventing those harms than we see the potential benefits from cannabis. And one reason, of course, is the schedule of cannabis and the fact that our studies on the medical benefits of cannabis are largely relegated to preclinical studies. So we know a whole bunch about how rats react to cannabis. We know a
Lucky
ton
rat.
about rat cells, and we know a ton about human cells in a petri dish. But in terms of understanding how this affects the human population in a positive way, that's still immensely underfunded. Now, where we are starting to see some movement is in this other area of harm reduction, right? And that's my area. Because I think the feds are kind of getting to the point where they're saying, well, people are using cannabis. Like we can't deny that anymore. Like so many states have legalized, like it's so normal. People are using cannabis. So how do we keep them from hurting themselves? And that has led to some support for harm reduction. Now, again, it's usually in the context of teens and pregnant women who we paternalize anyway. Um, I would like to see more research about just the general population. So, how do we maximize benefits and reduce risks around cannabis use in the general population? How do we reconcile people that are using cannabis therapeutically and medically with people that are using cannabis for other reasons when it comes to understanding healthy cannabis relationships? And that we're not looking at all, right? How do we balance public health with the fact that we now have an industry that's pretty much on the track of every other commodity-based industry, which is to get the heaviest consumers to buy as much as we can? How
Right.
do we reconcile that with what healthy, balanced consumption looks like? I don't see anything yet on
Yeah.
that. So I feel like we're definitely improving in terms of what we're studying, but it's still a lot of it is focused around how is it hurting people
Right.
and how do we keep it from hurting people as much as it already is.
And I think a new sort of player on my chessboard. I'm always looking at advancing things on my chessboard. Is that I say wasn't there when we started doing this work. Is the addiction industrial complex, right? That it's a lot of the same players as the prison industrial complex, a lot of the same hands out, like the drug testing companies. But this is really where um, it's hard to shed a light on, where things like cannabis use disorder comes from, like who decides that and the termination. And you and I were talking about this the other day, right? Like how can you um, understand why the population is using cannabis if you don't understand the medical benefits, right? Like, and knowing that when you look at data, like yes, there's more people using cannabis, but where is that spreading the fastest? Right? It's an adult,
Older
in
people.
seniors. Yeah, because you want to know why? Because their endocannabinoid systems are shot, right? And
Yeah.
that and we're an unhealthy country, right? If you have an out of whack endocannabinoid system and you're introduced to cannabis, you're gonna feel pretty good, right? And you're
Well, and
probably
I also think
that way
that
again.
the older folks are more impacted by the stigma and the legality. So when you see cannabis become legal, when you see it become more accepted and
Yeah,
normalized, it's the groups that were least likely to try it until it was okay,
yeah,
and until they could do it without smoking, that are the adopters, right? So we definitely see the biggest increases in use, even though they're still the smallest using group. We see the biggest increases in use among the older population. And one thing that I just want to go back to something you mentioned about kind of distangling medical use with something like cannabis use disorder, because one of our ways with other drugs that we measure disorder is frequency of use. And when you
right.
talk about alcohol, when you talk about cocaine, when you talk about some of these other substances that are also vulnerable to abuse and dependence, if
Right,
someone's like, I'm using it multiple times a day, you're like, disorder.
right,
But with
exactly.
cannabis, we see about a third of consumers say they use multiple times a day. And if you're using it medicinally,
Right,
you might need it multiple times a day. If you're using it in lieu of pain medication, in lieu of seizure medication, in lieu of anxiety medication, you are using it multiple times a day. So we can't use the same metrics
yeah,
for disorder that we have been doing with other substances. That being said, unhealthy and unbalanced cannabis use is real.
yes,
It is a thing. And so I think we have to come up with new ways, which is why I like harm reduction, right? Because harm reduction gets into motivations for
mhm,
consumption. It gets into desired outcomes and whether the consumption is meeting your desired outcome. It gets into other underlying benefits besides just getting high that someone might be getting from cannabis. And so I think we just have to take a more nuanced approach, which we hate doing. We like people to fill out a form and then we add it up at the bottom and we say yes disorder, no, no disorder.
yeah, yeah.
And so that's why I've actually developed a program I'm going to be piloting this summer called Cannabis and Balance, which is a program that helps people identify if their relationship with cannabis is healthy. And, they may be using for sleep, but are they also using it in a way at other times that isn't benefiting them? And how do they identify that? And I think this is important because
Absolutely.
we never teach people how to have healthy relationships with cannabis, just like we don't teach people how to have healthy relationships with food. But abstaining from food is not the answer to having an unhealthy relationship with food.
Right.
And just like abstaining from cannabis may not be the answer for somebody that has an unhealthy relationship with cannabis. So we have to evolve on this. And my hope is that the government will be interested in something like this because it's a harm reduction, right? So they do want people to have healthier relationships with cannabis if they can just get over the abstinence only paradigm.
Yeah. No, that's such important work. In fact, I've been asking people, within the cannabis industry, where do they send people who are having problems with cannabis? Because that is an issue, right? And I think, but also from the patient side of view, I always ask people, what would you ask your doctor if you didn't feel like you had to be an advocate? Right. And I think that's a really hard issue for people who are cannabis consumers is that they feel like there's this obligation that you
Mhm.
can't say anything bad about cannabis ever because you'll be feeding into the war on drugs, right? And it really people internalize that to the point where they're not, notifying people when they have a contaminated product, right?
Yep.
Like, there's no product safety system that works without consumers reporting.
Yeah.
Like
Well,
it
and
doesn't work. It doesn't work, right? It doesn't close the gap.
it's tough because I mean, you remember like when we were coming up and it was just advocacy and there was no industry or however you want to call it. We were kind of forced into this position by the prohibitionists because if we as advocates said anything about potential harm, the Kevin Sabets and all of those people on the other side would take it and just run with it and use it against us. And they would say, see, even the advocates admit that there's potential risks of cannabis. And it forced us into this all or nothing, black or white thinking around cannabis, where it was either completely safe, no dependence, no such thing as overdose, cures
Right.
every disease that you could ever imagine under the sun, or it's this terrible thing that leads straight to heroin that's going to make you crazy. And that was it. Those were your choices. You could be in this camp or this camp.
Yeah.
And it didn't really help us have realistic
Yeah.
conversations about cannabis and help people understand how to maximize the benefits of using cannabis, but also acknowledging that, like anything, there are risks. I mean, I wrote an article not too long ago comparing cannabis to exercise, both inherently healthy activities.
Hmm.
But if I were to engage in certain types of exercise or at certain times or when I have an injury or when I'm sick, I could hurt myself and
Right.
like severely. And I have hurt
Yeah.
myself.
That's
Um,
right.
and same with cannabis. Like if
Yeah.
you're using the wrong type of cannabis in the wrong way at the wrong time, the wrong thing for you, there could be risk and there could be harm. And I think we are at a place now, hopefully,
Yeah.
where admitting that doesn't negate the very real benefits. Just like admitting that if I were to go out and run a marathon right now, I would do serious injury to myself. That does not negate the fact that exercise is healthy.
That's such a good point. That's such a good point. And I think, over the years, Americans for Safe Access, we tried to hold that balance and we got beat up on both sides, right? We got
Yeah, you
a lot
did.
of, every time I was like, no, there are some risks, y'all. Like, oh, she's a Fed, right?
No. I know it was so tough. And I still see it today. I see people making comment, and I don't engage because there's no use, but I see people making comments online about cannabis, and I'm like, don't say that. Like you're painting this picture that is inaccurate. And if we want to continue to move the progress of access
Yeah.
forward, we have to be realistic about it.
Yeah.
And I think that that's because we're done with like the low-hanging fruit of progress. Like all the states that really were behind this, they've all passed laws. And yes, there's work to do in those states to make those laws better. I'm in Washington State. We recently got rid of the excise tax for medical cannabis patients, which was huge because we have a very high tax rate. So there's still a lot of work to be done. But now we're dealing with like the Alabamas and the
Right.
Texases and the Idahos and the Kansases and like the states that are not on board with this. And so we have to adopt messaging that isn't just like rah cannabis if we're going to be able to change the hearts and minds of the people that are coming at it with a huge bias in the other direction.
And I think this is a perfect sort of full circle this conversation, which is, really, the goal of Americans for Safe Access is to integrate cannabis into our healthcare systems, right? And so that means, that we have to move beyond the evangelical cannabis space, right? And it's, I can't do this alone, right? ASA can't do this alone. And it's really been people like yourself bringing your expertise to this space and us all doing it differently, right? The fact that we have so many different professionals coming in and taking their piece is really how we're going to integrate. And that means, yeah, that, coming with your, with the realistic goals and know that, you know, being a cannabis enthusiast is like being a sports fan, right? Like it's not everybody's cup of tea. I've never painted myself, up for an event, whether for a cannabis event or for a sporting event. So I don't see that any much. So I just want to again thank you not only for doing this interview with me, but just for all of your work. You're amazing, and
Oh,
I'll just
yeah.
leave you with a if you want to close out with any last thoughts.
Well, I would just tell the folks out there that I do have an educational platform, which is mypersonalplants.com. And I have a lot of content on there about finding this balance, about, how do we find the middle? How do we have real conversations? It's got a lot of practical information on there as well for talking to your doctor, talking to your parents, talking to your teen. So I would just encourage folks, if you're looking for information, if you're looking for kind of talking points, to bring in that middle of the conversation, then I would recommend checking it out.
Sounds great, Amanda. Thank you.
Thanks, Steph.